There's a castle in North Wales that appears on more postcards than almost any other building in Britain. 8 towers, honey-colored limestone above the Conwy estuary. Town walls still intact after 7 centuries. Turner painted it repeatedly. UNESCO listed it. Every travel guide in existence calls it one of the finest surviving examples of medieval military architecture in Europe, which it genuinely is. None of that is why it matters. Conwy Castle was built on a graveyard, not metaphorically, literally, on the site of the most sacred Welsh burial ground in North Wales, the monastery where the princes of Gwynedd buried their dead. Edward I moved the monks out, displaced the royal remains, and built his castle on top of the grave of Llywelyn the Great, the man who had come closer than anyone to uniting Wales as an independent nation. He did this deliberately. The beauty was the weapon. The stone was a statement. What it said, to every Welsh person who could see those towers from the hills around, was, "Your princes are gone, and we have put our castle on their bones." That is what Conwy Castle actually is. Chapter 1. The World Edward Destroyed, 1063 to 1277. To understand what Edward I built at Conwy, you need to understand what he replaced. Wales in the 12th and 13th centuries was not the romantic peripheral territory of popular imagination. A rugged margin beyond England's civilized edge, populated by poets and cattle raiders and not much else. It was a complex, functioning political civilization with its own legal system, the laws of Hywel codified in the 10th century, which were, by any serious comparative assessment, considerably more sophisticated and equitable than contemporary English law in their treatment of women, inheritance, property, and dispute resolution. Welsh women under Hywel legal system could own property, inherit land, and seek divorce on grounds their English counterparts would not recognize for centuries. Welsh land law was partable, divided among heirs rather than primogeniture, producing a different social structure and different political incentives. These were not customs, they were a jurisprudence. Alongside the law, there was literature. The bardic tradition in Wales was old, formally institutionalized, and technically demanding. The court poets who served the Welsh princes operated within a strict system of meters and meters. Welsh strict meter poetry is among the most technically constrained literary form in Europe, requiring mastery of 24 prescribed meters, each with its own complex rules of alliteration, rhyme, and syllabic pattern. The princes of Gwynedd maintained courts at multiple locations. The Elis, or royal hall, was a movable institution, and bardic recitation was central to the political culture. The poets were not decorative. They were functionaries. They recorded genealogy, celebrated victory, mourned defeat, and maintained the collective memory of the dynasty they served. Killing the dynasty killed the institution. Edward I understood this. It was part of the point. At the center of all of this, geographically, dynastically, institutionally, sat the region of Gwynedd. Northwestern Wales, from the Conwy estuary westward to the Llyn Peninsula, the heart of the matter anchored by the mountains of Snowdonia that had defeated every English army that tried to penetrate them in sufficient depth. Snowdonia was not just militarily significant, it was culturally so. The mountains were Welsh in the way that particular landscapes become identified with particular peoples over centuries of occupation, story, and naming. The Welsh name for the massif, Eryri, means the place of eagles. The English name is a corruption of the Norse word for snow. The naming difference tells you something about who was there first and who arrived later with different expectations. And at the heart of Gwynedd, overlooking the estuary of the River Conwy from the west bank, there was a monastery. Aberconwy Abbey was a Cistercian house, founded first in 1186 at Redanog Phelan near Caernarfon, then transferred to the Conwy site around 1199 after Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, known to history as Llywelyn the Great, became ruler of Gwynedd and made the abbey his personal foundation. His endowment was extraordinary. Over 40,000 acres of land covering much of Snowdonia and the Isle of Anglesey, more than any other Welsh monastery had ever been given. He did not do this out of simple religious devotion, though that may have been part of it. He did it because the abbey served a political function. Cistercian abbeys were centers of record-keeping and learning, nodes in the network of European ecclesiastical communication, and the abbots were men of education and negotiating skill whose services were indispensable to a prince navigating the complex relationship with the English crown. The abbot of Aberconwy served as Llywelyn's principal diplomatic representative in negotiations with the English. When Llywelyn needed to communicate formally with the English crown, and there were many such occasions across 40 years of political balancing, it was the abbot who carried the messages and the arguments. The abbey's library held the national records of the princes of Gwynedd, genealogies, charters, legal documents, the accumulated paperwork of Welsh political identity. It was, in the most practical sense, the archives of a nation. Llywelyn the Great died at the abbey in 1240, having taken the habit of a Cistercian monk in his final months. A not uncommon practice for medieval rulers who wanted to die in religious peace while maintaining the dignity of their position. He was buried beneath the high altar. His son and heir, Dafydd ap Llywelyn, was buried there in 1246. His other son, Gruffydd, who had died in a failed escape from the Tower of London in 1244. Falling to his death, when the rope he had made from sheets and clothing gave way under his weight, was repatriated to Wales by the abbots of Aberconwy and Strata Florida, and buried alongside his father and brother. 3 generations of Gwynedd's rulers, the institutional heartland of Welsh independence. The Aberconwy Abbey Charter was the name given to the Treaty of Aberconwy of 1277, in which Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, Llywelyn the Great's grandson, was forced to sign away most of what his grandfather had built, reducing himself from ruler of a recognized Principality of Wales to a petty lord confined to Gwynedd, west of the Conwy. The abbey was named in the treaty. The most humiliating diplomatic settlement in Welsh medieval history was signed in the name of the monastery that held the bones of Wales's greatest prince. Edward I understood what this place meant. He had read the settlement documents. He had sent his ambassadors to negotiate with the abbots. He knew the abbey's political function and its symbolic weight, and its role in the memory-keeping that sustained Welsh political identity. When he came to build his castle in 1283, after finishing the job the 1277 campaign had started, he chose the abbey site. Not because it was the only defensible position on the Conwy estuary, it was not. Because it was the right place to make the statement he needed to make. The conflict between England and Wales had been running since before the Norman conquest. English kings had been pushing west into Welsh territory since Offa built his dyke in the 8th century. The specific shape of the 13th century conflict was Edward I's inheritance of a problem his grandfather John and father Henry III had mismanaged. Both had made the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267 possible, or rather had made it inevitable, by failing to prevent Llywelyn ap Gruffydd from accumulating the political recognition that the treaty formalized. When Henry III formally acknowledged Llywelyn as Prince of Wales, a title that implied suzerainty over all the Welsh princes, he created a political structure that his son would have to spend enormous resources dismantling. J. Beverley Smith of the University of Wales, in his authoritative biography of Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, observes that the 1277 Treaty of Aberconwy reduced Llywelyn to a petty prince in Gwynedd, confined to the inhospitable districts of Snowdonia and Anglesey. The Welsh had gone from recognized national leadership to a rump principality ringed with new English castles in a single campaign. But confined is not the same as destroyed. Llywelyn was still there, his claim was still there, his people were still there. The 1277 settlement was a containment, not a solution, and Edward knew it. In 1282, Llywelyn's brother, Dafydd, who had changed sides repeatedly over the preceding decade, allying with the English, then with the Welsh, then back, launched surprise attacks on English-held castles across Wales on Palm Sunday. The provocation was a complex mixture of personal grievance, territorial dispute, and the accumulated pressure of living under an English administration that found new ways to make Welsh life difficult every year. Llywelyn joined him, whatever his private reservations about the timing. Edward came north with a force of exceptional professional organization. On the 11th of December 1282, near a ford at Irfon Bridge in mid-Wales, Llywelyn was killed. He had separated from his main army, apparently in the hope of meeting supporters from mid-Wales. He rode into a trap. The English infantry cut him down. Whether any of them recognized who they had killed in the immediate aftermath is unclear from the sources. His head was taken to London and displayed at the Tower with ivy around it, a mocking reference to the prophecy that he would be crowned in London. Brut y Tywysogion recorded the response of those who heard the news. The hope of the Welsh perished, and they could not contend with the king. Dafydd kept fighting until the summer of 1283. He was captured, tried, and executed, hanged, drawn, and quartered, the first recorded use of that particular method of political killing in English legal history. The charge was treason against a king he had pledged homage to. The sentence was calibrated for maximum physical degradation. His body was dismembered, and his parts distributed to different towns as public warnings. The last native prince of Wales died in pieces. What Edward I did with the victory that followed was not merely military occupation, it was total architectural. Chapter 2. The Graveyard Choice, 1283 to 1287. Edward I arrived at the mouth of the Conwy estuary in March 1283 and made a decision that was not militarily necessary. He could have built at Conwy. The ruins of Conwy Castle sat on the east bank of the estuary, a promontory that had served as an English defensive position for generations, controlling the river crossing from the English side. It had military logic. It had existing infrastructure, damaged but salvageable. It had the advantage of not requiring the displacement of a Cistercian monastery and its associated community, records, and royal graves. Edward chose not to build at Conwy. He demolished what remained of it entirely and never rebuilt it. The ruins were abandoned. Then he crossed the river to the west bank, to Welsh soil, to the abbey site, and started building there instead. This requires explanation because the military literature on Edward's castles often focuses almost entirely on defensibility and site selection logic, and Conwy's rock promontory does have genuine defensive advantages. A ridge between the Giffen Stream and the Conwy estuary, approachable by land from only one direction, capable of being supplied from the sea. All of this is real. But it was not the only defensible site on the estuary. Conwy was also defensible. The selection of the abbey site over the existing English position directly across the river was a political choice dressed in military pragmatism. The Wikipedia article on the castle states it plainly, in a way tourist materials often do not. Edward's plan was a colonial enterprise, and placing the new town and walls on top of such a high-status native Welsh site was in part a symbolic act to demonstrate English power. Samuel Liberty, in his 2020 thesis at the University of North Texas, examining the colonial dimensions of the Edwardian Castle program, goes further. The site selection was part of a systematic strategy of symbolic as well as physical dominance, erasing Welsh institutional identity from the landscape by replacing its most significant material expressions with English stone. Edward moved the monks. He paid for it, a compensation of £40 for the land, and funding for a new abbey at Maenen, 13 kilometers up the Conwy Valley, where the monks transferred in 1284 with the portable contents of their house and with the coffin of Llywelyn the Great, transported by river to the new site. He was careful. He retained the abbey church on the original site, converting it into the parish church of the new English town, St. Mary's Church in Conwy, whose core structure still incorporates 13th-century fabric from the Cistercian foundation. He did not demolish everything. He did not need to. What he needed was the ground, and the statement that occupying it made. Construction began in March 1283 and continued until the castle reached a working standard around 1287. This was extraordinary speed. The workforce peaked at approximately 1,500 workers in the summer of 1285. Masons, carpenters, plasterers, smiths, diggers, brought predominantly from England because Edward did not want Welsh labor on a fortress whose primary purpose was to control Welsh people. The costs, including the town walls built simultaneously, came to approximately £15,000, equivalent to well over £30 million in modern purchasing power. This was not economizing. It was investment. The scale of expenditure was itself part of the message. The architect was Master James of St. George, a Savoyard master mason, from the region between modern France and Switzerland, whom Edward had encountered during his continental travels and recruited to build his Welsh fortresses. Historian Mark Morris described James as one of the greatest architects of the European Middle Ages, and the physical evidence at Conwy supports the assessment. Historian Jeremy Ashby, in his detailed Cadw study of the castle, described the royal apartments in the inner ward as the best-preserved suite of medieval private royal chambers in England and Wales, a remarkable survival that reflects both the quality of the original construction and the particular form of the castle's later history, which ruined it structurally but left much of its internal fabric intact. The castle James designed at Conwy is architecturally specific to its site in ways that repay close attention. It is long and narrow, stretched along the ridge between the Giffen and the estuary, divided into an inner and outer ward by an internal wall and ditch that gives the building a final defensive fallback within its own walls. The 8 towers are distributed along both sides of this elongated plan, projecting from the curtain walls to give overlapping fields of fire along every approach. The earliest surviving stone machicolations in Britain project from several of the towers, projecting galleries built out from the wall face on corbels, with gaps in the floor through which defenders could drop missiles on attackers directly below, without exposing themselves to fire from the siege lines. This was the cutting edge of late 13th century military technology, imported directly from James's continental experience. The postern gate deserves particular attention because it recurs in the castle's history at several critical moments. Cut into the inner ward at river level, it allowed direct access from the castle's residential core to the River Conwy below, bypassing the outer ward entirely. In the event of a siege that had succeeded in taking the outer ward, The king and his household could still be supplied by river from the sea. The postern was not an afterthought. It was the structural solution to the fundamental vulnerability of any land-based fortification, that it can be cut off from supply. By incorporating a sea lane into the design, James and Edward created a castle that could in principle hold indefinitely against any force that did not also control the Irish Sea. This was the design intelligence that kept Edward I alive in the winter of 1294, and that kept the Tudor brothers' 40-man rebellion viable for 3 months in 1401. Work on the town walls proceeded in parallel with the castle. They were, from the beginning, a single integrated project. Over 1,200 meters of wall, 21 towers, 3 original gateways, most of which survive today. The constable of the castle was, by the royal charter of 1284, also the mayor of the new town of Conwy, the same individual holding both offices simultaneously. The administrative fusion of military and civilian governance was constitutional from day one. By royal decree issued in 1284, no Welsh person could hold land or office within the borough. The walls enclosed a space that was legally English. Everything outside them was occupied Wales. The monks at Maenen buried the coffin of Llywelyn the Great in their new abbey church. Over the promontory where he had died and been buried, the English raised 8 towers. The statement was complete. Chapter 3. The Walled Town and the Excluded People, 1284 to 1294. The castle was never the whole project. Edward I's strategic innovation at Conwy, repeated at Caernarfon, Harlech, Beaumaris, and several other sites, was the integration of castle and planned town into a single system of colonial settlement. A castle alone could hold territory militarily, but could not hold it demographically. Without settlers, every English garrison eventually thinned out, became dependent on local supply chains, began to intermarry with the local population, and gradually absorbed into the community it had been placed to control. Edward had watched this process undermine earlier English positions in Wales. The solution was not a bigger garrison, it was an English population. The new borough of Conwy was planned from the beginning to be English in population, English in law, English in commerce, and physically separated from the Welsh world around it by walls that were simultaneously defensive works and social barriers. English settlers were recruited to come, offered land grants, trading privileges, legal protections from across England, with particular recruitment from Chester, Lancaster, and other northern towns whose commercial networks Edward wanted to plug into his new Welsh boroughs. The settlers who came were merchants, craftsmen, and their families, the human infrastructure of a colonial economy. They held their burgages, the plots of land within the borough walls, on terms that required them to be English and to remain so. The specific legal exclusion of Welsh people from the new boroughs was set out in the borough charters. No Welsh person could hold a burgage within Conwy. No Welsh person could serve as a burgess, the formal status that conferred voting rights and participation in the borough's governing institutions. No Welsh person could trade in the markets of Conwy, Caernarfon, Beaumaris, or the other Edwardian boroughs without paying special fees and operating under specific restrictions. The commercial monopolies of the English boroughs extended outward into the surrounding Welsh countryside. The market at Caernarfon, for instance, had a monopoly that extended 8 miles in every direction, forcing Welsh producers and consumers to engage with the English commercial system even when they were outside the walls. The historian R.R. Davies of the University of Oxford, in his 2000 work, The Age of Conquest, Wales 1063 to 1415, which remains the definitive academic treatment of this period, characterized the Edwardian borough system as a structure of deliberate ethnic and economic exclusion. The towns were instruments of English colonization in a specific, precise sense, creating English enclaves within Welsh territory and systematically redirecting Welsh economic activity through English commercial intermediaries. Welsh people could trade with the English. They could not participate in the same commercial system on equal terms. They could not own property within the walls. They could not hold office. They could not contribute to the governance of their own region through any institution that the new system recognized. What this meant in practice is worth dwelling on at human scale. The Welsh community that had lived around the abbey site for generations, farmers, tradespeople, the families who had supplied the monastery and benefited from its market, were now living outside a wall that enclosed a space they had no legal right to enter on equal terms. The monastery, that had been the center of their community's religious and political life, had been converted into a parish church for English settlers. The fishing and trading on the Conwy estuary, the estuary's rich salmon runs, and its access to the Irish Sea had sustained communities here since the Iron Age, now operated under conditions set by English burgesses who controlled the market. The Welsh could see the castle from their fields. They could see the English settlers in the market that now occupied the site of their abbey. They were on the outside of a wall that had been built to keep them there. The garrison that maintained this arrangement was, as noted, remarkably small. The constable oversaw 30 soldiers at full establishment, 15 crossbowmen, supported by a carpenter, chaplain, blacksmith, engineer, and stonemason. What the castle was doing was not primarily physical coercion of a specific population. It was psychological architecture, the permanent, highly visible, seemingly indestructible assertion that this was how things were and how they would remain. The towers did not need to be full of soldiers to perform their function. They needed to be there. They needed to be visible. They needed to loom over the estuary and the town below, and the Welsh countryside beyond, in a way that communicated permanence. Edward had not conquered Wales by winning a battle. He had conquered it by building things that could not be argued with, could not be negotiated away, could not be pretended out of existence. The stone was the policy. In 1284, the Statute of Rhuddlan formalized the post-conquest legal settlement in comprehensive terms. English common law was imposed throughout Wales. The Welsh principalities were reorganized as English counties. Welsh customary law, including the laws of Hywildidi, with their protections for women and their distinct approaches to property, was explicitly abolished and replaced with English legal structures. The title of Prince of Wales, which had been a Welsh political identity for a century, was reserved for Edward's heir. His son, born at Caernarfon that same year, received the title in 1301 when he came to Conwy to receive homage from the Welsh leaders. It was here, in this castle built on the grave of Llywelyn the Great, that the Welsh magnates knelt to an English prince wearing a Welsh title. The symbolism was deliberate and complete. Edward believed this was the end of the matter. He believed, as colonial administrators consistently do, that the physical facts he had created were permanent and self-sustaining, that the combination of military architecture, demographic replacement, and legal transformation would eventually dissolve Welsh political identity into English normalcy. He was wrong about that, but he had most of a decade before he found out. Chapter 4. The King Besieged, 1294 to 1295. 10 years after the castle was completed, Edward I found himself trapped inside it with his wine running out. The rebellion of 1294 was the first serious test of whether the colonial system embedded in the Edwardian castles was as permanent as Edward believed. The answer the rebellion gave was complicated. The castles held, and the rebellion failed. but the conditions that produced it had not gone away and would not go away, and the system Edward had built was considerably more expensive and difficult to maintain than he had imagined when he designed it. The leader of the uprising was Madog ap Llywelyn, a distant relative of the royal house of Gwynedd, who had been landless before the conquest. A detail that matters, because it means his grievances were not simply dynastic. He had no claim to Llywelyn ap Gruffudd's position. What he had was the accumulated resentment of a population that had been excluded from its own political and economic life for a decade, subjected to English taxation and English law and English commercial dominance, and denied any institutional means of expressing or redressing those grievances. The specific trigger in 1294 was an English summons demanding that Welsh men serve in Edward's campaign in Gascony. Military service in the wars of a king whose system excluded them from legal citizenship in their own county. When Madog raised his standard in the autumn of 1294, he found support across a much wider geographic and social range than purely dynastic rebellion would have generated. The speed of the uprising's initial success demonstrated how thin the English position in Wales actually was beneath the stone. Within weeks of Madog's initial actions, Welsh forces had overrun or threatened Caernarfon Castle, seized almost completely, as well as Castellbwy Bir and Harlech, and a number of the Marcher castles at Denbigh, Hawarden, and Ruthin. The garrisons of these castles were caught between determined attack and the practical difficulty of reinforcement across hostile territory in winter. The English settlers in the boroughs fled or cowered behind whatever walls remained defensible. The picture that emerges from the fragmentary records is of an English colonial position that had been built to look permanent, but which, under pressure, was neither as deep nor as stable as the stone implied. Edward himself had been planning a campaign in France when the news from Wales arrived. He cancelled the continental expedition and moved north with his main army, marching into a situation that quickly developed worse than anticipated. Moving along the North Wales coast with his forces stretched out along difficult terrain in December weather, he was cut off from the bulk of his army by Welsh troops, and catastrophic flooding from the Conwy and its tributaries, which ran high from winter rains and blocked the roads that would have kept him connected to his reinforcements. He retreated to the only fortified position he could reach, Conwy Castle. He was there from December 1294 into February 1295. The postern gate to the river was his lifeline. Supply ships came up the Conwy estuary from the Irish Sea and through the gate with food, fuel, and news of the outside world, while Welsh forces controlled the land approaches and the town itself had been abandoned by its English inhabitants, who had fled when the rebellion arrived. The position was secure, but deeply uncomfortable. Edward was a king who had conquered Wales, built the most expensive castle network in English history to hold it, and was now sitting in one of those castles while his colony fell apart around him. The chronicler Walter of Guisborough recorded a detail that historians have returned to repeatedly, in part because it is one of the few humanizing anecdotes that survives Edward's Welsh campaigns. That given the severity of the conditions, the king refused to drink his own private wine supply and had it shared out among the garrison. Whether this was genuine generosity, calculated gesture, or the kind of informal arrangement that simply made sense in a besieged space where morale mattered more than precedence, it produced the kind of story that circulated and improved in the telling. The image of Edward sharing his wine at Conwy, while the Welsh pressed the walls, became a minor legend of royal equanimity under pressure, and its persistence in the chroniclers suggests it touched something important about how medieval kingship was supposed to perform itself, even in extremis. Relief came in February 1295, when English forces arrived and broke the Welsh siege lines. The rebellion's military climax came at the Battle of Maes Moedog in March 1295, where English longbow tactics proved decisively superior against Welsh mounted forces attempting to fight on open ground. A preview of the battlefield dominance that English armies would demonstrate repeatedly in the following century, from Crecy to Agincourt. Moedog was captured after further campaigning, imprisoned, and died in the Tower of London at some point before 1312. His rebellion was over, but its implications were not. The revolt had demonstrated several things simultaneously. It showed that the castle system worked as designed when functioning correctly. Conwy had held against a force that overwhelmed every surrounding position, sustained by its sea access and its professional garrison, exactly as James of St. George's postern gate had intended. It showed that the colonial settlement was not self-sustaining. The English borough of Conwy had been abandoned by its civilian population under pressure, suggesting that English confidence in the borough's security was considerably less robust than Edward had calculated. And above everything, it showed that the Welsh had not accepted the conquest. They had waited 10 years, organized themselves around a new leader with a different kind of claim, and fought. They had come within a flood and a postern gate of forcing the King of England to abandon his most important Welsh castle. The hope that Brut I Tywysogion said had perished with Llywelyn at Irfan Bridge had been rebuilt quietly, in a generation's worth of accumulated resentment, and it would be rebuilt again after every subsequent defeat for another 100 years. Chapter 5. The King Who Lost His Throne, 1399. For most of the 14th century, Conwy Castle performed its role as regional administrative hub and prestige royal residence, with the variable attention that distant properties typically receive. A survey in 1321 found it poorly equipped, leaking roofs, rotten timbers, a crossbow complement so neglected that only 10 of 30 were usable, bow strings missing from all 21 longbows. The first constable, Sir William de Sicon, had been replaced by a succession of administrators whose primary qualification was loyalty rather than competence. Edward the Black Prince took it over in the 1340s and carried out substantial repairs. The Great Hall vault was rebuilt, probably in 1346 to 47, under his chamberlain Sir John Weston, and it served him as a functioning residence when he was in North Wales. It declined again after the Black Prince's death in 1376. This cycle of patchy maintenance was the characteristic condition of a castle that was too expensive to keep in perfect order, too politically significant to abandon, and too remote from the centers of English power to attract sustained administrative attention. Then, in the summer of 1399, the castle became the setting for one of the most consequential deceptions in English political history. Richard II had been king since 1377, when he came to the throne at 10 years old following the death of his father, the Black Prince. His personal courage had been demonstrated vividly in 1381 when, as a 14-year-old, he rode into the crowd of the peasants' revolt at Smithfield and talked the rebels down after their leader, Wat Tyler, had been killed beside him, an act of genuine physical bravery that multiple contemporaneous chroniclers recorded with admiration. His cultural sophistication was real. His court was one of the most artistically distinguished in Europe in the 1380s and 1390s, a patron of Chaucer and of the refined courtly culture documented in the Wilton diptych. But courage in a moment of physical crisis is not the same as the sustained political intelligence that medieval kingship required, and Richard's 3-decade reign demonstrated the difference between these qualities with increasing clarity as time passed. By the 1390s, Richard had developed a conception of royal authority so exalted and so rigid that his practical relationships with the English nobility had become unworkable. He had exiled or eliminated the Lords Appellant, the baronial coalition that had once controlled his government, and ruled through a small circle of favorites whose promotion and enrichment alienated the broader nobility whose cooperation he needed to govern. When John of Gaunt, the most powerful magnate in England and the anchor of Lancastrian loyalty, died in February 1399, Richard confiscated the entire Lancaster inheritance, the vast estate that should have passed to Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, and extended Bolingbroke's existing exile from 10 years to life. This was the act that finished him. He had deprived the most powerful noble house in England of its inheritance for no legal reason anyone could clearly articulate, and every nobleman in the country understood that if it could happen to Lancaster, it could happen to any of them. Bolingbroke returned to England in June 1399 with a small force that grew rapidly as disaffected nobles flocked to him. Richard was in Ireland dealing with a deteriorating political situation when the news reached him. He returned to Wales, landing near Milford Haven in the south, then moving north, to find that virtually all English support for him had evaporated. The great lords had calculated who was winning and had made their choice. Richard had almost nothing: a few loyal household knights, diminishing cash, and the physical walls of Conwy Castle. He reached Conwy on 12th August. He was safe in the only sense that mattered militarily. The postern gate to the river meant he could be supplied indefinitely. The walls that had held against Madog's full Welsh uprising in 1294 would hold against any force Bolingbroke could put in the field in 1399. Richard was not militarily trapped. He was politically trapped, secure inside the walls, helpless outside them, with no army coming to relieve him and no political strategy that could retrieve the situation from inside a castle in North Wales. Henry Percy, the first Earl of Northumberland, Bolingbroke's most powerful ally, came to Conwy as his representative. Percy swore an oath in the castle chapel that Richard's life would be spared, and that Bolingbroke sought only the restoration of his inherited Lancaster lands, not the crown itself. He swore this in a church, at an altar, which in the medieval framework of sacred oath-taking was the most binding form of commitment available. Richard left Conwy on the basis of that oath. On the road between Conwy and Flint, he was surrounded. A hidden company of Bolingbroke's men-at-arms had been positioned in the hills. Percy's oath was broken within hours of being sworn. Britannica's account of the episode describes Richard as enticed out of hiding in Conwy Castle, accurate as far as it goes, if slightly restrained in its assessment of what enticement involved. He was lured out under false pretenses by a man who swore sacred oaths and did not keep them, and he was made a prisoner before he had gone 20 miles from the walls that could have protected him. Richard was taken to Flint, then London, then Pontefract Castle. He was formally deposed on the 30th of September, 1399. Parliament accepted 33 articles of deposition read by the Bishop of St. Asaph, and Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV on the 13th of October. Richard died in February 1400. The official record says he refused food and starved himself. The French chronicle Trahison et Mort says he was starved. His skeleton, examined when Henry V later had him reburied honorably in Westminster Abbey, showed no signs of violence. Whether he died by his own choice or was killed by enforced starvation remains genuinely unresolved across the sources, and the ambiguity is itself revealing. A regime that needed to depose the king also needed the deposed king to stop being a focus for restoration plots, and the methods available were limited. Conwy Castle is where the old Plantagenet order of direct royal descent ended. Not at the formal deposition proceedings in Westminster, not at Pontefract, where Richard died, but here, in the inner ward above the estuary, in the room Jeremy Ashby described as the best-preserved medieval royal chamber in England and Wales, where a king was talked out of his only protection by a man who swore on a chapel altar and walked away from the oath before the day was done. Chapter 6. The Carpenter's Trick, 1400 to 1401. 2 years after Richard II was talked out of Conwy Castle, 40 Welsh rebels walked in. The context matters enormously. Henry IV had taken the English throne in September 1399 on questionable legal grounds. He was not the nearest heir by standard succession rules, a fact that would generate dynastic instability for decades, and he immediately began facing challenges to his legitimacy. In Wales, the situation was specific. Richard II had been, relatively speaking, a good king for Welsh people who had managed to navigate the English system. He had promoted Welsh servants, granted individual Welshmen the legal status of Englishmen, and created real opportunities for advancement within the English royal household for people who would otherwise have been permanently excluded. Henry IV's succession closed those doors abruptly. Owain Glyndwr was a Welsh nobleman of genuine royal lineage, his bloodlines connected to both the northern and southern Welsh dynasties, with a specific legal grievance against Reginald Grey, Baron of Ruthin, who had unlawfully seized some of his lands and whose influence with Henry IV meant that Owain had no recourse through English legal channels. The grievance about the land was real, but what transformed a property dispute into a national uprising was the broader context. A population that had lived for 120 years under the colonial system the Edwardian castles enforced, denied political agency, excluded from economic life, governed by laws that treated Welshness itself as a category of legal disadvantage. On the 16th of September 1400, Owain proclaimed himself Prince of Wales. The rebellion spread rapidly through North Wales. Henry IV marched into Wales with a punitive expedition that, by the spring of 1401, appeared to have suppressed the immediate revolt. He issued a general pardon for Welsh rebels in March 1401. He specifically excluded 3 individuals from that pardon: Owain himself and his cousins Rhys ap Tudor and Gwilym ap Tudor, brothers from a noble Anglesey family who had served Richard II as esquires before the usurpation, and who now found themselves permanently on the wrong side of the new regime. The exclusion from the pardon was effectively a death sentence. The Tudor brothers had no route to safety except through negotiation, and negotiation required leverage. They had 40 men, personal courage, and detailed knowledge of North Wales. They decided to take the most visible symbol of English power in their region and use it as their bargaining chip. Conwy Castle, on Good Friday, April 1st, 1401, had most of its garrison in the little church in the walled town, attending the Easter service. The castle was left with a skeleton crew of watchmen. The brothers had spent time gathering intelligence about the schedule, the garrison, the gate procedures. They had recruited a Welsh carpenter who had legitimate access to the castle, he had been doing repair work there, and who agreed to be the mechanism of entry. The carpenter presented himself at the castle gate on the morning of Good Friday as if coming to continue his work. The account in Adam of Usk's Chronicon, the most contemporaneous surviving source for the episode, records simply that the carpenter feigned to come for his accustomed work. He was admitted. The 2 watchmen on duty were killed. The gate was opened from the inside. The Tudor brothers and their 40 men walked into Conwy Castle. Welsh rebels then attacked and took the walled town. For the first time since its construction 118 years earlier, Conwy was in Welsh hands. Henry IV responded with urgency and alarm. Henry Percy, Hotspur, the young Earl of Northumberland, who was already famous for his military skill and his characteristic aggressive impatience, was dispatched with 120 men-at-arms and 300 archers. He looked at Conwy Castle and understood immediately that taking it by force was not a realistic option. The walls that had resisted Edward I's besiegers in 1294 would resist Hotspur's force in 1401 just as effectively. He began negotiations instead. The negotiation lasted months. What eventually emerged from it reveals the power dynamics that even a successful Welsh military action could not overcome. The Tudor brothers would surrender the castle in exchange for pardons for themselves and their men. But Prince Henry, the future Henry V, then 17, commanding the negotiations on behalf of his father, attached a condition to the offer. The brothers had to hand over 9 of their own men for execution. Not English soldiers captured in the course of the seizure. Their own Welsh comrades. 9 people who had fought beside them for months, trusted them, followed them into one of the most audacious military actions in Welsh history. The brothers handed them over. The 9 were seized as they slept after their night watches, according to the sources, and killed. Rhys ap Tudor was eventually captured and executed in 1412, when he was outlawed again following a renewed involvement in Glyndwr's rebellion. Gwilym received a full pardon in 1413. Their youngest brother, Maredudd ap Tudor, who had stayed out of the 1401 action, had a son named Owain, who anglicized his name to Owen Tudor and entered the service of Henry V's court. Owen Tudor entered into a secret marriage with Henry V's widow, Catherine of Valois. Their son Edmund was made Earl of Richmond by Henry VI. Edmund's son was Henry Tudor, who became Henry VII in 1485. The family that produced the man who seized Conwy Castle on April Fool's Day 1401, the family that produced Rhys ap Tudor, who sacrificed 9 of his own men to save himself, produced 3 generations later the first Tudor king of England. Rhys was executed. His great-grandnephew was crowned. The castle that had been the symbol of everything the Tudor family was excluded from became, in a different sense, theirs. Chapter 7. The Laws that Built the Castle's Meaning, 1402 to 1485. Here is the chapter that the tourist brochures omit entirely. The Glyndwr Rebellion lasted 15 years, from 1400 to approximately 1415, and at its height in 1404 Owain controlled most of Wales, had been formally crowned Prince of Wales at a parliament in Machynlleth, had allied with France, Scotland, and dissatisfied English nobles, including the Percys, and had created something that had not existed in any institutional form since 1283, a Welsh political authority with the apparatus of government. He had a parliament, he had chancellors, he had a foreign policy, he had plans for a Welsh university and an independent Welsh church. By 1409, all of it was gone. Harlech Castle, Owain's last stronghold, fell in February 1409 after a prolonged siege. His wife, daughters, and grandchildren were taken to the Tower of London, where they died. Owain himself disappeared, never captured, never found, his fate permanently unknown. He is unique among the great rebels of medieval Britain in this. He did not die in battle, was not captured, was not executed, did not surrender. He simply ceased to appear in the historical record around 1415. Welsh tradition remembers him as sleeping, like Arthur, waiting to return when Wales needs him. Historians are less romantic, but equally uncertain. We don't know what happened to him. We don't know where he died or where he is buried. The English response to the rebellion was not reconciliation, it was legislation. The penal laws of 1401 and 1402 represent the most comprehensive legal articulation of what the Edwardian castle system had been enforcing informally since 1284. And they deserve to be quoted in some detail because they are what Conwy Castle was built to sustain. From the 1401 statutes, no Welshman was allowed to purchase lands or tenements within England, or within the English borough towns of Wales. No Welshman could be accepted as a burgess in any borough. From the 1402 statutes, no Welshman could serve as a justice, chamberlain, chancellor, treasurer, sheriff, steward, constable of a castle, receiver, escetor, coroner, or hold any other significant legal or administrative office in Wales or the Marches. No Welsh child could be educated or apprenticed to any trade. No Englishman could be convicted in any legal proceeding on the evidence of a Welshman. The garrisons of castles and walled towns in Wales must be filled with brave English persons, and not with men of mixed blood from the said parts. No Welshman could bear arms, hold any castle, or defend any house. Read these laws in the context of the castle at Conwy. The castle was the constable's seat. The constable held his office under laws that prohibited Welsh people from occupying that office. The walled town the castle anchored was legally inaccessible to Welsh property ownership. The markets the town hosted operated under monopoly arrangements that forced Welsh economic activity through English channels. The legal proceedings conducted in the county, administered from the castle, treated Welsh testimony as legally subordinate to English testimony. The historian R.R. Davies characterized these laws as designed to establish permanent English dominance in Wales, not as a wartime emergency measure, but as an intended permanent state of affairs. Samuel Liberty's 2020 thesis drew an explicit comparison between the Edwardian borough system and later English colonial plantation settlements in Ulster. Created on confiscated land, populated with imported settlers, protected by military installations, and sustained by legal structures that treated the indigenous population as perpetually untrustworthy. The comparison is not anachronistic. The mechanisms are the same, and the same logic of demographic replacement and legal exclusion runs through both. Liberty notes that the borough plantation system can be seen as a direct predecessor to the Ulster plantation settlements of the 16th and 17th centuries. The English colonial toolkit was developed and refined in Wales before being applied elsewhere. These laws were not temporary. They remained in force, with modifications, until the reign of Henry VII, who granted exemptions to Welsh people on a case-by-case basis, but did not abolish the underlying framework, and were only fully superseded by the laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542, when Henry VIII formally incorporated Wales into the English legal and parliamentary system, and gave Welsh people equal legal status with the English for the first time since 1284. 250 years. From the completion of Conwy Castle in 1287 to the laws in Wales, Acts of 1535, is 248 years. The system that the castle was built to anchor, the exclusion of Welsh people from the legal personhood that the English borough system conferred, the prohibition on Welsh participation in governance, the requirement that the garrisons be English persons rather than men of mixed blood, lasted, in formal legal terms, for 2.5 centuries. The UNESCO inscription on Conwy Castle describes it as one of the finest examples of late 13th and early 14th century military architecture in Europe. This is accurate. It does not say what the military architecture was for. The penal laws of 1401 and 1402 say what it was for. And they say it with the unself-conscious clarity of documents that were not trying to be diplomatic about their purpose. Chapter 8. The Archbishop's Betrayal 1627 to 1665. By the 17th century, the system the castle had enforced was gone. The laws in Wales Acts of 1535 and 1542 had made Welsh people legal Englishmen, formally, if not always practically. The Welsh gentry had been absorbed into the English landowning class, many of them eagerly, sending their sons to Oxford and the Inns of Court, intermarrying with English families, taking on English surnames, and serving in English Parliament. Finding their interests aligned with the English state in ways that made the memory of the penal laws a historical embarrassment rather than a present grievance. The bardic tradition had declined under the pressure of print culture and English literary dominance, though it survived in modified form, and would be deliberately revived in the Eisteddfod tradition of the 18th century. The castle had no enemies left in any operational sense. The specific colonial enterprise it had been built to anchor had achieved most of its objectives and quietly dissolved into a different political order. Charles I sold it in 1627 to Edward Conwy, the first Viscount Conwy, for £100. The price tells you everything about the castle's physical condition and perceived value. The roofs were gone. The timber was rotten. The iron fittings had been stripped and sold at some point during the long decades of neglect. £100 was not a purchase price. It was a token gesture of transfer. The kind of sum you attach to a transaction when what you really want is to be rid of an obligation rather than to gain an asset. The castle's military utility was approximately zero in a Wales that had been legally incorporated into England for nearly a century. It was a very large, very impressive ruin. Then the Civil War began, and impressive ruins suddenly mattered again. In 1642, when Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham against Parliament, John Williams, Archbishop of York, born in Conwy in 1582 in a house on Chapel Street, took charge of the ruined castle on behalf of the king and set about repairing and garrisoning it at his own personal expense. Williams was a figure of extraordinary political complexity. He had been one of the most powerful men in England under James I, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, which made him effectively Lord Chancellor, the most senior judicial and administrative officer in the kingdom below the king himself. He had then fallen catastrophically. Archbishop Laud had engineered his disgrace in the 1630s, had him tried in the Star Chamber, fined £10,000, imprisoned in the Tower of London. He had been liberated and rehabilitated when Laud himself fell in 1640, and the Long Parliament reversed his conviction. By 1642, he was Archbishop of York and back in his native North Wales, and the decision to repair Conwy at his own cost was driven by a combination of genuine royal loyalty, the sense of personal debt to a king whose courts had eventually vindicated him, and a specifically local patriotism that made defending the estuary town where he had been born feel like something more than mere political positioning. He invested substantially. The work was real. The repairs were genuine. He had every right to expect recognition. He received, instead, Sir John Owen. Owen was a cavalry officer from the royalist heartlands of Caernarfonshire, personally brave, professionally effective, possessed of the particular combination of military confidence and political insensitivity that Prince Rupert found useful in subordinates and that tended to make enemies of allies. In 1645, with the royalist cause deteriorating badly, the Battle of Naseby in June had destroyed the royalist field army, and the war was effectively lost, though the garrisons had not yet acknowledged it. Rupert granted Owen the governorship of Conwy Castle over Williams's explicit objections. The Archbishop argued his case. Rupert overruled him. Owen arrived at the castle with his troops, including a contingent of Irish soldiers who had crossed from Ireland to serve the king. Williams refused to leave. Owen forced the doors with iron bars, physically ejected the archbishop he had displaced, and took possession of the building that Williams had personally rebuilt. It was a small act in the context of a civil war, but it was the kind of small act that reverberates through the individual who experiences it. Williams had given his money and his reputation to this castle, and a cavalry officer with a prince's backing had thrown him out of it. Williams defected to Parliament. He was a meticulous defector. He knew the castle's restored defenses in exact detail because he had designed them. He knew the town walls, which gates were strongest, which sections were most vulnerable, where the artillery should be placed to achieve maximum effect. When General Thomas Mitton's parliamentarian army arrived at Conwy in August 1646, Williams was not simply a sympathizer standing at a safe distance. He was actively coordinating the assault, directing Mitton's attention to the Porthwy Phelan Gate, timing the attack for maximum effect, applying his architectural knowledge to the business of taking down what he had built. The town fell. Some of Owen's Irish soldiers, caught in the streets when the walls were breached, were bound by parliamentarian forces and thrown into the estuary. The specific treatment of Irish Catholic soldiers captured in Welsh and English Civil War contexts was consistently savage. They were regarded not as prisoners of war entitled to quarter, but as foreign mercenaries whose presence was itself a crime. The estuary received them. Owen held the castle itself from August into November 1646, bombarded from positions on the hills across the Giffen Stream. He wrote repeatedly to his king, received no useful response, maintained his garrison with professional stubbornness as the cause collapsed around him. Williams wrote to Owen telling him that Charles had surrendered to the Scots in May, and that further resistance served no purpose. Owen was not persuaded by correspondence. He negotiated terms in November. His soldiers marched out with their banners and swords, but not their muskets. Professional honor preserved. Military defeat acknowledged. Parliament slighted the castle, deliberately damaged the bakehouse tower to make it unusable as a fortification. In 1665, the remaining iron and lead were stripped and sold. What was left was the bare stone walls and towers, open to the sky, stripped of everything functional, preserved only by the inherent durability of the limestone that James of St. George had chosen for its building. The castle that Edward I had built to control the Welsh ended its military life as a casualty of English domestic politics. The people most consequentially dangerous to its stability were never Welsh rebels who attacked from outside. The castle was taken by 40 men because of a carpenter's trick and a garrison at prayer. It was delivered to Parliament by the Archbishop, who had rebuilt it, in retaliation for the arrogance of an English cavalry officer. Its military history concluded not with Welsh resistance, but with an English archbishop coordinating an English artillery bombardment against an English garrison holding a Welsh castle in an English civil war. The Welsh, in whose names and against whose interests the castle had been built 3.5 centuries earlier, were not the protagonists of its ending. Chapter 9. Turner's Vision and the Beautiful Lie, 1665 to present. The castle's second life began with painters, specifically with painters who had no interest in its history. J.M.W. Turner visited North Wales in the 1790s and painted Conwy Castle multiple times over 3 decades, from different angles, in different atmospheric conditions, across the full arc of his developing style. The 1798 watercolor at the Getty Center shows the castle in a storm. Fishermen struggling to bring boats ashore in a churning estuary, the towers looming above in breaking light that dramatizes the contrast between human fragility and geological architectural permanence. Turner described his method in Wales as finding the dramatic effects of natural light and using castle ruins as compositional anchors for atmospheric studies of sky and weather. The castle in the painting is not a political object. It is a sublime one, massive, enduring, indifferent to the small figures in the foreground. The history inside the stone is not visible from the estuary. This was not accidental. The romantic aesthetic that Turner helped define and that made North Wales one of the most painted landscapes in Britain across the late 18th and early 19th centuries was specifically structured around the experience of the past as picturesque, beautiful in its decay, moving in its evidence of time's passage, but not requiring historical knowledge or political engagement to be appreciated. You did not need to know why the castle was built or what it had been used for to feel what Turner was showing you when he painted it. You needed only eyes and a capacity for the specific emotion that crumbling medieval architecture against stormy sky reliably produced in educated European observers of the Romantic period. Wordsworth wrote about Conwy. Tennyson visited. The picturesque movement had created a market for North Welsh landscapes, rocky, dramatic, empty of the industrial development that was filling England's Midlands, and Conwy Castle was perfectly positioned to supply it. The combination of impressive ruins, dramatic estuary, mountain backdrop, and the town's medieval walls made Conwy one of the most visited sites in Wales by the early 19th century, before the railway existed. The railway, when it came, transformed everything. Robert Stephenson's tubular bridge, built in the 1846 to carry the Chester and Holyhead Railway across the Conwy estuary, was built immediately adjacent to the castle walls. Stephenson, in a gesture of architectural deference that was also extremely practical, the bridge needed to pass through the medieval town walls at both ends and could not afford to look jarringly alien, decorated the bridge's entry towers with castellation to match the medieval stonework beside them. The railway that delivered Victorian tourists to Conwy dressed itself in castle aesthetics to do so. Telford's suspension bridge, built in the 1820s, had done the same thing with its towers. The infrastructure of modern tourism was camouflaging itself in the castle's visual language to borrow its prestige. The tourist economy that grew up around Conwy through the Victorian period was structured almost entirely around the aesthetic experience of medieval architecture. The towers, the walls, the views from the battlements across the estuary to the mountains, and not around historical understanding of what the architecture had been built for or what it had enforced. The guidebooks that appeared after the railway arrival discussed the castle's involvement in the Wars of the Roses, the Civil War, the Glyndwr Rebellion, the deposition of Richard II. They presented these events as exciting episodes in a colorful national story, the kind of romantic historical narrative that the Romantic movement had established as the proper way to engage with medieval ruins. The castle in these accounts is a stage set for history. Dramatic events happened here. Interesting people passed through. Architectural features were impressive. Rather than an instrument of a specific political project directed against the people whose land it occupied. They did not present the castle as a colonial installation. They did not describe the town walls as the physical boundary of an ethnic exclusion system. They did not mention that the borough the walls enclosed had been legally inaccessible to Welsh people as property owners and burgesses for 2.5 centuries. The laws of Hywel Dda that the castle's legal apparatus had replaced were not discussed. The penal laws that the castle's administrative function had enforced were not quoted. The specific human cost of living on the outside of a wall that defines who counts as a person within the political community it encloses was not the kind of thing that Victorian heritage writing was interested in or equipped to address. This is not simply Victorian blindness, it was the Victorian era. The colonial system the castle had enforced was in many ways being renewed in different forms across the British Empire, while the guidebooks were being written in India, in Ireland, in Africa, in the Pacific. Describing Edward I's Welsh program as colonialism would have required the Victorian writers to use a framework that, by the standards of their time, carried no critical charge. Colonialism was what empires did. It was what England was doing, on a global scale, at the moment these guidebooks were produced. Describing Conwy as a colonial enterprise would not have been a critique. It would have been a compliment. The UNESCO inscription in 1986, listing Conwy alongside Caernarfon, Harlech, and Beaumaris as a World Heritage Site, used the language of universal cultural heritage. The finest examples of late 13th and early 14th century military architecture in Europe. Exceptional universal value. This language is accurate as far as it goes. The castles are genuinely extraordinary achievements of military engineering. The architectural innovation they represent, the concentric planning, the integrated castle and town system, the Savoyard technical elements that James of St. George introduced to British castle building, influenced defensive architecture across Northern Europe for a century. None of this is false. What the UNESCO inscription does not say is that these finest examples of military architecture were built to enforce the political, legal, and economic subjugation of the Welsh people. That they anchored a colonial system that excluded Welsh people from legal personhood in their own land for 2.5 centuries, that the abbey site on which the finest of them was built was chosen specifically for its sacred and dynastic associations with Welsh national identity as an act of deliberate symbolic erasure. The UNESCO inscription treats the castles as objects of universal human achievement. The history treats them as instruments of a specific political project directed against a specific people. Both frameworks are available to visitors. Only one of them appears in the brochures. KW, the Welsh Government's historic environment body that manages Conwy today, has in recent years become more willing to present the castle's history with something approaching full honesty. The information boards have evolved. The colonial framing appears more explicitly than it did 2 decades ago. The acknowledgement that the town walls were instruments of ethnic exclusion rather than simply civic fortification has become more prominent. This is genuine progress in heritage interpretation, and it reflects a broader willingness in Welsh cultural institutions to engage with what the Edwardian conquest actually meant and means. But the postcard image persists. The Turner prints are in the gift shop. The UNESCO citation leads every guidebook entry. The towers against the estuary are genuinely beautiful, and beauty is a powerful form of forgetting. Chapter 10. Where is Llywelyn buried? Llywelyn the Great's stone coffin is in Llanrwst, in the Gwydir Chapel beside St. Grust's Church. You can see it. It has been there since the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII closed Mainan Abbey in 1537, and the coffin was brought for safekeeping to the Wynne family's church. The coffin is empty. The body itself, moved by the monks when they left Conwy for Meanan in 1284, reburied in the new abbey church at Meanan, then separated from its stone container at some point during the dissolution and the subsequent centuries when an unendowed ruin has no community to maintain the memory of what it holds, is not in it. The whereabouts of Llywelyn the Great's physical remains are unknown, not uncertain, not approximately known. Unknown. The man who founded Aberconwy Abbey, who died there and was buried beneath its high altar, whose burial ground Edward I chose as the site for the most powerful castle in his Welsh chain. He does not have a known resting place. His bones are somewhere in the ground of North Wales, or they are not preserved, or they are in an unidentified location that has never been excavated with that specific question in mind. The early 16th century historian who noted the empty coffin at St. Groust's wrote that the whereabouts of Llywelyn's corpse remain a mystery. It is still a mystery, 5 centuries after that was written. This is not a minor footnote. It is the condition that the castle's founding act produced, and it has persisted without resolution for 740 years. Conwy Castle stands on the ground where Llywelyn the Great was buried. The monks took his coffin north when Edward I pushed them out. The dissolution scattered what the monks had preserved. The body that had been beneath the high altar of the most important monastery in North Wales, the body of the man whose grave Edward chose to build on because of what that grave meant, is gone in a way that no amount of archaeological survey has yet reversed. The castle that replaced him is one of the finest buildings of medieval Europe. The man it replaced has no known grave. Edward I did not intend the body to be lost. He funded the monks' move to Maine. He paid for the new abbey to be built. He did not want the dispossession to look like desecration. He wanted it to look like administrative relocation. The monks' requirements considered and accommodated. The Welsh princes' graves handled with appropriate care. The deliberate choice to use the abbey site did not require the deliberate loss of Llywelyn's body. The loss came later, through the dissolution, through the centuries when Maine Abbey gradually became ruins, and its records were scattered, and its graves were no longer maintained by a community with institutional memory of what they held. The dissolution of the monasteries is where most of the direct physical evidence of pre-conquest Welsh institutional life disappeared. The abbey records that had been held at Aberconwy, the library that had been dispersed to Mainen, the graves of the princes that had been maintained for 3 centuries. Henry VIII's institutional program finished the work that Edward I's political program had begun, removing what remained of the material infrastructure of Welsh dynastic memory. What we are left with, on the promontory above the Conwy estuary, is a castle in perfect preservation. 8 towers, accessible to visitors who pay the Cadw admission fee. Royal chambers that Jeremy Ashby described as the best preserved suite of medieval private royal chambers in England and Wales. A postern gate to the river that kept Edward I alive, and gave 40 Welsh rebels a strategic foothold. Town walls that enclosed a space legally inaccessible to Welsh people for 2.5 centuries. The earliest stone machicolations in Britain, one of the finest examples of medieval military architecture in Europe. All of this is true. The question the estuary poses, and it is a genuine question, not a rhetorical formulation with a predetermined answer, is what it means that we describe this as heritage. Heritage is the word we use for the past we decide to maintain and present to the living. Conwy Castle is heritage because it has been decided, through accumulated institutional choices made over centuries. English monarchs who kept it, Victorian municipalities who opened it, UNESCO committees who listed it, the Welsh government's KW who manage it today, that it is worth preserving and worth visiting. Those decisions are not neutral. They are decisions about what the past means, whose past it is, and what we want to carry from it into the present. The Welsh government manages this castle. That is not an insignificant fact. The institution whose predecessor organizations maintained the colonial system the castle enforced for 2.5 centuries has been replaced, after a very long interval, by a Welsh institution that manages the castle as part of Welsh heritage. Cadw's stewardship has, in recent years, become more honest about what the castle was built for. The information panels now describe the colonial enterprise more directly than they did a generation ago. The town walls function as ethnic exclusion barrier is acknowledged. The human cost of the conquest appears in the interpretive materials. This is genuine progress. It reflects a broader shift in Welsh cultural institutions toward engaging with the Edwardian conquest as a political act, with specific consequences for specific people, rather than as a romantic historical backdrop. But the postcard image persists. The Turner prints are in the gift shop. The UNESCO citation leads every guidebook entry. The towers against the estuary are genuinely beautiful. And beauty is a powerful mechanism for simplification. What Turner painted was real. The stone is exactly as beautiful as he showed it. What he did not paint, because it was not his subject, was the history inside the stone. The history is still there. It does not require Turner's light to be seen. It requires only the willingness to look at the castle and ask who built it, for what purpose, on whose ground, and at what cost to the people who were already there. The stone is magnificent. The stone was built on a graveyard. The stone enforced a system of ethnic exclusion for 250 years. The stone is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, described as a triumph of medieval architecture. The stone survives, the institutional memory of what it replaced, the abbey, the records, the dynastic burial ground, the legal tradition of Hywel, the political identity of the Welsh princes, is mostly gone, surviving in fragments. The empty coffin at Llanrwst, the core of St. Mary's Church that preserves 13th-century Cistercian stonework, the scholarship of historians like R.R. Davies and J. Beverly Smith, the traditions of Owain Glyndwr Day on the 16th of September, the political and cultural conversation about Welsh identity that continues today, and that the castle itself helped produce by being the most visible and most beautiful of the things that ended what it displaced. The question the empty coffin at Llanrwst asks, and that the full record of Conwy Castle's history cannot finally answer, is whether a stone built to erase a memory has succeeded in erasing it, or whether the memory is still there, inside the stone, waiting for the people willing to read it. Llywelyn the Great's body is somewhere in North Wales. We don't know where. Edward I built one of the most beautiful buildings in Britain on the place where the search should begin. That question is still open.